Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our top stories. The Supreme Court has frozen Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's move to fire the head of the National Security Service. The cabinet approved the early dismissal of Ronan Bar, which has led to widespread criticism. Meanwhile, Israel has threatened to continue to take territory in Gaza while Hamas continues to hold hostages. This follows strikes that have reportedly killed at least 91 Palestinians. Hamas has fired rockets at Israel in response as fighting continues following the collapse of the Gaza ceasefire. Counter-terrorism police are leading the investigation into an unprecedented fire that has shut Britain's Heathrow Airport, causing worldwide travel chaos. Nearly 300,000 passengers have been directly impacted. Ukrainian officials say that Russia has launched one of its largest drone attacks on the Black Sea city of Odessa. The attack comes as the Czech president visits Ukraine while the United States continues to push for peace between the two countries. Reports suggest that new Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney will call a snap election for the 28th of April. The 60-year-old political newcomer faces a worsening US trade war along with domestic challenges. US President Donald Trump has invoked emergency wartime powers to expand the domestic production of minerals. The executive order uses Cold War-era legislation in an attempt to reduce US reliance on imports. Sudan's army says it has recaptured the presidential palace from the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The move marks a major turning point. The paramilitary forces are fighting back in the capital. Argentina's biggest umbrella union has announced its members will strike on April the 10th in protest against Javier Milei's economic austerity measures. A key focus of the 24-hour action will be rising unemployment. We start in America, and US President Donald Trump has invoked emergency powers to boost domestic production of critical minerals to rely less on China. The executive order utilises the Cold War-era Defence Production Act, declaring that dependence on rival nations for minerals poses a national security threat. Meanwhile, Trump has also announced that the United States would soon sign a deal with Ukraine for access to its rare earth minerals. On the other hand, Trump has also demanded that courts stop blocking his agenda. A federal judge in a strongly worded order had asked the Justice Department to explain why it went ahead with flights to El Salvador of prison-bound Venezuelan migrants, some of whose representatives said they had committed no crime and were targeted only for their tattoos. Trump responded to this in a post on his online platform Truth Social by stating that it is his goal to make America great again, and such a high aspiration can never be done if radical and highly partisan judges are allowed to stand in the way of justice. Following this, Trump's senior advisor, Elon Musk, promoted the America PAC, a pro-Trump political action committee established by Musk, and said it would give $100 to Wisconsin voters who signed the petition in opposition to activist judges. The petition, which Musk reposted on his social media platform X, urges Wisconsin voters to sign by April the 1st, when the northern state elects a judge for its Supreme Court. Well, joining us to discuss all of these developments is Ross Feingold, a political risk analyst who is joining us from Taipei in Taiwan. Ross, thank you ever so much for joining us once again. I want to first look at this mineral deal, this Cold War era ruling that Trump has sort of looked at to get this mineral deal through and get reliance away from countries like China. Do you think this move by Trump is justified, and what could be the ramifications of it?
It is justified under the law. I don't think this is going to survive any type of legal challenge. What I mean is a legal challenge is not going to change the decision of the Trump administration to cite that section of the law in order to expand mining in the United States. There are a lot of laws that do have these kinds of national security bases for carrying out a decision, and we see Trump using those bases in trade-related matters, in immigration-related matters. So I think he has a good case that this is within the presidential authority to do this, and it could be that the private sector will be willing to invest more money in domestic mining and refining, and that the United States might, over time, lessen its dependence on China for some of these minerals.
Yes, Ross, looking at the action that he's already put in place and some of the moves that he's made, of course, judges looking to block them or pause them. He has hit out against judges, specifically looking at the deportation of Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador. Is there a risk here that Trump is potentially making this a war where it's him versus the judicial system? And how might that also play out?
It's not necessarily going to play out poorly for Trump, keeping in mind that Trump has appointed many judges during his first term. Many conservative judges were appointed to the federal courts during Trump's first term. And of course, the Supreme Court has a 6-3 conservative majority, which was also based on several appointments during the first Trump administration. So going into the courts or being challenged in the courts is not necessarily a losing battle. It's certainly time consuming, but as it goes up to the appeals courts, where again any of these matters reach the Supreme Court, it's very possible that the Trump administration will win. So I think Trump administration looks at the courts as a nuisance, but not necessarily an impediment to what they want to do.
Yes, and looking at somebody who was key to Trump's campaign and is now a key member of Trump's top team, Elon Musk, and what he said to people in Wisconsin, saying that he'll pay them $100 if they sign a petition. Firstly, is this even legal?
I'm not familiar with the Wisconsin state law on this subject. It might very well be illegal. Musk could afford some very brilliant lawyers. I don't think he would proceed if this was blatantly illegal.
Okay, and then looking at the impact of Musk and how he has been shaping parts of US politics with his actions and his words and using his money, his platform, and also his notoriety. Do you think this is a pattern that we're going to see continuing with Musk backing Trump up and using that might that he has politically and also financially?
Yeah, the interesting thing here is that he's inserting himself into a state-level election. So last year, he inserted himself into the presidential election with an enormous amount of money that he donated to support Trump's election, using his own platform as a megaphone through posts on Twitter, or X as it's called now, to build support for President Trump. And now he's doing it on the state level and in a race for the state courts. So it'll be very interesting to see whether or not he motivates voters in Wisconsin to vote the way that Trump and Musk want, which is to vote for the conservative Republican candidate. So we'll have to see how that turns out at the state level as opposed to the federal level. But at the state level, he might have outsized influence. It's a population-wise, it's a relatively small state. He could certainly reach a lot of people through spending money on television ads, online ads, and these kinds of votes. It's what we call in America an off-year election. It's not a year when there's a presidential election. So it's all about turnout. And if he can motivate conservative voters to come out and vote for the conservative judge candidate, they might very well win.
Yes, and Ross, to bring an end to this discussion, we have, of course, seen not radical, but serious steps being made by Trump to follow through on the promises that he's made. And despite the challenges, he seems to be moving forward. Do you think this is a blueprint that will continue throughout the rest of his term?
Very likely. We know that advisors to President Trump, they believe very passionately in the executive branch's authority over the government. And they talked about that during the campaign. Advisors made that very clear when they would do interviews or they would write commentaries during the presidential campaign, that they see that the president, or they view the president's authority as extremely expansive over the executive branch of government. They don't believe that certain agencies are independent of the president, for example. So they talked about doing this, and now they're actually doing it. So it's not a surprise, and we'll have to see how much of it holds up in the courts.
Ross Feingold, as always, thank you so much for your time and your excellent insight. We will now stay in North America, and reports are suggesting that Canada's newly sworn-in Prime Minister Mark Carney is expected to call a national election this Sunday, with voting set for April the 28th. This comes after Carney took over as Liberal leader following Justin Trudeau's resignation. The election is likely to focus heavily on the ongoing trade dispute with the US and President Donald Trump's tariffs, with Carney positioning himself as the candidate best equipped to handle US President Donald Trump's trade war, promising to maintain Canada's tariffs if Trump continues his economic pressure. Recent polls show a tight race between Carney and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who previously held a strong lead. Carney's election would set the stage for a 5-week campaign. Despite being a general political newcomer, he is set to face off against Poilievre and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. This election comes months ahead of the scheduled fixed date, with 343 seats up for grabs in the House of Commons after a recent redistribution. The timing of the election is crucial as Canada faces significant challenges related to trade, jobs and the economy. Well, joining us to discuss this impending snap election call is Daniel Boardman, a senior correspondent for the National Telegraph, who's joining us from Ottawa, Canada. Daniel, thank you very much for joining us. Firstly, I think we have to obviously make sure that this is happening. In your opinion, is the snap election imminent, and do you think it's set for the date that we've mentioned, the 28th of April?
This is the shortest possible election possible. I mean, some Americans might find it crazy that Canada can have it's like a 35-day election, 36 days, and that's the whole thing. Incredible. This is the sort of the most popular Liberals will ever be. They were deeply unpopular under Justin Trudeau, and Donald Trump really gave them a gift by, instigating this trade war and starting to spout off megalomaniacally about tariffs every 48 hours or so. So Mark Carney, who was most Canadians view as an unelected insert into prime ministership, a lot of Canadians feel that way because the Liberal leadership race was not open to all. And again, most internal party elections in Canada are in some way undemocratic or pseudo-democratic, possibly. So he has the best distancing from Justin Trudeau right now. If he were to get into office and start to govern the way he wants to govern, he would deeply become unpopular instantly because he was the advisor for Justin Trudeau. All the failed policies of Justin Trudeau are Mark Carney's policies, exactly. But he knows how to articulate them, let's say, in a different way, whereas Trudeau was more emotional blackmail. Vote for me if you're a good person. People who don't vote for me are not good people. All good people are Liberals, from the heart outwards. And people started to see through this as him being a bit of a buffoon and a fop. Mark Carney is the same exact thing, except in a suit. So instead of emotive nonsense, you have technobabble. So this is the appeal of smart people are Liberal. Look at the suit I'm wearing. I used to run the Bank of England. Look at all this money I printed. I know everyone. I'm very, 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 very smart. This is why we need to cap our emissions and our production. And we can't get our oil and natural resources to market because if we exchange our resources for money, we will then have wealth and an economy. And that's not how finance and economies work. Trust me, I ran a bank. That's the new appeal of Mark Carney. And it's sort of working, but it only works when it has the illusion running. So right now the media, which Canadian media is all, they're stenographers of the Liberal Party, all of them, all the mainstream ones. So right now they could just push out as much, Carney propaganda as they can. But the problem is every time Mark Carney gets in front of a camera and has to answer questions, he gets exposed. So this is the shortest possible time frame. He doesn't have to go into the House of Commons. He can call an election. He can run against Donald Trump instead of Pierre Poilievre, because when people listen to the things Pierre Poilievre says and does, they tend to like them. For example, Mark Carney's two most popular things he's done that he is advertising he's doing now: one, repealing the carbon tax, which was Pierre Poilievre's entire thing. And the second thing he's promoting he's done is remove GST tax on new home buys under $1 million, which was straight out of Pierre Poilievre's platform. So all the popular things that he's selling to Canadians that he's doing for the country are all from the Conservative platform.
Yes.
So this is his problem. is...
Daniel, sorry to interject there. I want to look, we know of course the difficulties that Canada is currently facing now with the trade war and tariffs, but can you explain to our audience some of the challenges that he's facing domestically in Canada, some of the things that people are unhappy with after the Trudeau reign?
Yeah, so mass migration is one of the ones that Canadians, no party's really brave enough to talk about. But again, we were a country of 30 million people under Justin Trudeau, and then we are now a country of 40 million people later, and most of that growth is due to immigration. The student visa program is way out of control. We have so many temporary foreign workers who have overstayed their visas and all that. Housing is another big issue as an offshoot of both the money laundering criminal enterprises that launder money through real estate in Canada, and also the mass migration have created a very big immigration problem and housing problem that people are dealing with. And there's a massive cost of living problem as well, because again, of all of Trudeau's failed policies and inflation, every time, the Liberals get so lucky every time the country catches up on them and realizes that their policies have caused a massive cost of living crisis. There's something new that happens in the news, whether it be the Russia-Ukraine war or in this time Trump's tariff war, where they could say, oh, great, Trump tariff war, this is the best thing possible for the Liberals, because now they can just shift all their failed economic policies onto Donald Trump and say, well, the reason why everything is so crazy right now is because of Donald Trump. And some people might remember, well, things were crazy 3 months ago, 4 months ago, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, 7 months ago, the last couple of years. But when you have the entire media apparatus willing to just push, literally they'll run the ads of the Liberal Party and the attack ads of the Liberal Party as news on Canadian news broadcasting stations. So when you have that type of media ecosystem, they can kind of just push out whatever narratives they want. But there are hardcore cost of living crisis in Canada, national identity crisis in Canada, immigration crisis, housing crisis, inflation, any type of serious economic problem or cultural problem you can think of, we have in Canada.
Yes, and to bring an end to this discussion, Daniel, I want to look away from Mark Carney and look at the people that will be challenging him. Can you talk to us just briefly about those who are vying for his position?
So it's Pierre Poilievre or Mark Carney. Pierre Poilievre is the Conservative. He's going to run a center-right Conservative campaign, and Mark Carney is going to run a pretend center-right Conservative campaign with some radical leftism mixed in. And then there's Jagmeet Singh, who has completely destroyed the NDP. His policy is, I guess, Khalistan Zindabad. We'll see how that goes in Canada. But the NDP is being totally wiped out. The NDP vote is flown totally into Liberals. They're a nonsense party. You then have the Bloc Québécois, which are running in Quebec on Quebec things. They're a separatist party. They'll get a good amount of the votes. So that's the Canadian political landscape there.
Daniel Boardman, thank you very much for your time. We will, of course, keep an eye on when that election is called, and we'll be heading into it on the 28th, if things are to be believed. But we move on now to South America, and Argentina is grappling with economic turmoil under President Javier Milei, whose controversial austerity measures and reforms have sparked widespread protests. While inflation has dropped from 211% to 118% last year, the country still faces severe economic challenges. Milei's promises of dollarization and public spending cuts have led to public unrest. The General Confederation of Labour has called for a 24-hour strike by April the 10th, 2025, in response to layoffs and reduced purchasing power. Unions argue that Milei has worsened unemployment and eroded workers' rights. While the government continues to struggle with currency devaluation, inflation remains high, and despite some optimism about lifting currency controls, economic forecasts remain bleak. Meanwhile, protests against the president continues. A ring of steel was erected around Congress, with several streets cordoned off and metal grills barring access to the building. Well, to discuss these developments and the upcoming protest, joining us is Professor Madhav Nalapat, the editorial director of the Sunday Guardian, who's joining us from India. Professor Nalapat, thank you as always for joining us and for your time. We have a situation here in Argentina where the economy is improving, but at what cost? And why are the people unhappy?
Look,
The fact is that inflation is still horribly high. And frankly, this is a lesson that Donald Trump needs to learn from, for a simple reason that when you push reforms beyond a point at which they are acceptable to the broad public, then frankly, those reforms cannot work, however well-intentioned they are. In the case of Javier Milei, that's precisely what has happened. He has pushed, he has basically laid off tens of thousands of Argentinian employees, state employees, who were promised a lifetime job, and now he just laid them off. And more importantly, inflation has gone down, but is going down way too slowly for the Argentinian people. And of course, I agree that some of the austerity measures are necessary. At the same time, you have to ensure that the poor are looked after. That there is some kind of a floor below which you cannot fall, even if you have nothing. And that floor has to be provided in the shape of food, in the shape of some kind of housing, and some quality health care. Let's be honest. It can't happen any other way. That's a lesson that Prime Minister Modi has learned in India. He's got a health care program. He's also got a food distribution program, which frankly has been distributing food to 800 million people, which is something of an historical record. And the reality is, in housing also, efforts are being made to ensure low-cost housing. But unless there is a floor to even those who have nothing, well, very frankly, there is going to be an upwelling of protest. And that protest could well derail all the well-intentioned reforms that are being tried. Javier Milei is definitely well-intentioned, but the fact is he may have gone too far, too fast, and frankly, he may not have looked after, the poor of Argentina, and as a consequence, people in the middle class asking, what if this is me tomorrow? What if I get in this situation and I'm practically begging on the road tomorrow? So the reality is that you have to have a policy of reform, correct, but you also have to have a clear floor below which even a person or a family that has no income, zero income, gets something. And this goes against the grain of some of these ideologues. They say that, you're not getting a job because you don't deserve a job. Well, that may be true in the case of some. It's certainly not true in the case of all. But the sad reality is, if unemployment persists for 5 to 7 years, then you become almost unemployable. It's impossible to retrain you into getting a productive job. So then you become unemployable. And even at that stage, frankly, if you have nothing, well, Karl Marx said very clearly, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And you're going to see violence and protest take place. So I think, Marx maybe, his economic policies may or may not have worked, but certainly that particular, the point needs to be stressed, which is there has to be a clear flow. And oddly, that point was stressed by a conservative economist of the previous, era, Alfred Marshall, one of those who founded modern economic science. And Marshall said what he called the residuum, the lowest level of society, you have to look after them.
Yes.
And Marshall was a very modern economist. He basically was a Keynesian before Keynes came on the scene. And I think that lesson of Marshall needs to be learned by Javier Milei. And frankly, beyond a point, that ring of steel will also fail. It didn't work in the case of Bashar Assad because people were so disgusted with what was happening that finally even the ring of steel melted down and began supporting them. And that is what happened in Bangladesh, where the corruption of Sheikh Hasina led to several in the military supporting the anti-Hasina forces. Of course, there's been a blowback now, and there is some reconsideration of that policy. But you have to understand there are limits beyond which you must not allow your citizens to endure. And if you do so, you are at risk, because then people who are higher up the food chain will start getting nervous, there go I tomorrow. So I think that's a lesson, frankly, that Javier Milei hasn't learned, and he would do well to learn, because these protests are not new. In 2024, there were violent protests, and at that time it worked. At that time, people were willing to give him a chance. Today, much less people are willing to give him a chance. They had too much of poverty, combined with too much of 100 and whatever inflation, which is still way too high. That means prices are double in a year, which is way too high. So I'd like to say that lesson of what Marshall called the residuum, and looking after the residuum needs to be learned by Javier Milei if his reforms are to succeed, and he has to backtrack on some of the more radical of them, such as, for example, removing from jobs so many Argentinians. I think, very frankly, that's created a certain degree of helplessness, which is then hopelessness, and then the helplessness gets transformed into violence. So that is something that he needs to watch out from.
I want to look at what could be done in this instance then, because of course he's been very extreme with how he's looking to tackle austerity, these anti-austerity measures. How else can he go about it without making these radical changes? Of course, you've mentioned already high levels of unemployment that are growing, also looking at the social sector and how that's being treated. What can he be doing differently, and how might that improve relations with the people, which is something that he's obviously needing to do given the current discontent that we're seeing amongst some?
Well, that's a very, very good point. And I'd like to say that, you have to understand that even the very rich need to understand that the very poor need to be looked after for them to be safe in any country. Even the very rich need to understand that. I mean, if that lesson is not learned, you go the way of Sheikh Hasina and become a refugee, and your government falls and extremists take over. That's what happened in several occasions. Extremists took over, initially at least, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the Taliban have now come back, and of course they're now shifting their policy a little bit. But the reality of the situation is, when those who have nothing look from their shanties, from their huts, which, by the way, are routinely destroyed by the police, and they look at the huge skyscrapers and the limousines and the condos and the villas of the very rich, frankly, that helplessness turns into anger and a hopelessness that says, all right, all I've got are my chains, maximum I lose is my life, and anyway this life is not worth living. When people start believing that their lives are not worth living, that particular government is at risk. And I fear that's happening to Javier Milei in Argentina.
Professor Madhav Nalapat, thank you very much for your time. We will, of course, be keeping an eye on Argentina and these protests that are coming up on the 10th of April. But that is, unfortunately, all we have time for. We will, however, continue to bring you more of the latest from across the world.